G'day, Delta here, and I would like to talk to you about the static lighting in Ready or Not. A very cool discovery was made the other day in that with the current version of the community mapping framework, we can now open up cooked levels within the editor. A very cool discovery, and it allows us to look behind the scenes in void maps and see how they approach a lot of different techniques for lighting and placing assets around the map. To do this, all you need to do is on an empty level, go over to your levels tab and just add an existing sublevel. Choose whichever ones you would like to open. I would only recommend opening the art and the lighting ones, because if you try and open up the core or the barricaded suspects or gameplay versions of sublevels, you'll most likely crash the editor. And really at the moment, we're really only stuck with the art and lighting, so we'll go ahead and just have a look at those. So the purpose of this video is to peek behind the curtain to see how Void lights their maps and the different elements that contribute to lighting in an Unreal Engine 5 scene. So looking at the different values for light scattered around the scenes, things to do with, say, the skybox, the light mass settings, the volumetrics, the fog, the post-processing values, reflections, and anything else that we can find in between that might actually help us understand lighting in their maps. It would be important to note too that this video is not a critique on how well or bad Void lights their maps. I'm not really in a position to do that, and I don't want to do that. This is really just a look at how Void lights their maps and whether or not any cool techniques can be observed from it, and just a general exploration on what has been done within their maps. So if you're interested in that, sit back and enjoy. To begin with, I think it might be cool to just talk about the different trends that are happening within their maps. After opening them and exploring through all of them, these are some pretty consistent patterns I have seen throughout all their maps. To begin with, all their world settings are set to default. This was a little bit surprising to me. They don't mess with the quality, the bounces, the volumetric light map density at all. The only observable change I have noticed was that they increased the shadow map resolution to 2048 instead of the default. It's pretty standard change, nothing surprising. The one thing they do leave default, which is pretty noticeable, is that they do compress their light maps still. So I do say noticeable because one of the largest criticisms from the game is that the shadows often feel low quality and very splotchy, and Valley is a very good example of this because, well, the interiors of the scene are pretty much just flat materials without a lot of detail to break up those shadow maps. So if we go and explore the different rooms here, you can see that the shadow maps do look pretty bad. There's a lot of stepping going on. They do look a lot JPEG-y. Where the walls and floors and ceilings meet, where the ambient occlusion often occurs, is often a point of a lot of artifacting. And I feel like this is probably one of the biggest, I guess, like issues that the game has with lighting that is consistent throughout all the maps. And there is good reason for them to actually compress the light maps too. The first one is in-game, you may actually get a little bit of a performance boost because you are no longer dealing with larger texture sizes for the shadow maps, but I think the visual trade-off here is probably not worth it. The other big benefit though is that the file size of the shadow maps is significantly reduced. When you uncompress a light map on, say, a map this size, the shadow maps themselves could be about maybe a gigabyte, and when you reduce when you compress the light maps, it probably reduces it down to about 200 megabytes. And when you have, say, over 20 maps in a game, that compression setting is a big saver, especially if your target platform is consoles as well. The final thing I've noticed is that Void do not mess around with the indirect lighting settings on any of their lighting. For those who don't know, indirect lighting intensity basically adjusts the amount of light contribution a particular light has on a scene's global illumination when you bake the lighting. So if you have a dark room, increasing the indirect lighting intensity will help that particular light fill out the room a bit more, as if the light is bouncing around it more cleanly. The downside is that it requires a light bake to actually do it. So if your lighting takes, say, an hour or more to bake, then it's not a particularly iteratively friendly way of doing it, because you will have to manually adjust these up or down depending on the final results. So what Void opts to do instead is to use fake lighting, which is simply placing down lights where they feel like they need that additional global illumination, or where they may want to change the tone or feel of a particular section of the map. Unfortunately, there isn't many examples to showcase in Valley because there just isn't. And I will probably showcase this a lot better in future videos where I cover other maps. But to quickly give you an example of what a fake light might look like in a map would be something like, for example, if this map here, if I was looking at this room and I felt like that corner is particularly dark, and to be fair, it does seem pretty dark. So if I want to increase the, I guess, like the general global illumination in there, I can quickly place a light down in the scene, and I can quickly adjust the attenuation radius and the intensity to sort of fill out that scene. It's not really doing much at the moment, so let's turn off the inverse square fall off. And obviously doing something now. Let's adjust the attenuation radius so we're just kissing the wall there, maybe a little bit more. And this is obviously way too bright, so let's jump this down to something a bit more manageable. So let's turn this on and off to see the value now. Maybe let's quickly adjust the color to be a little bit more on the same warm tone of the map. And then we see also we've got a large reflection coming in from the source of this light here. So we can fix that by increasing the source radius and messing with the soft source radius as well. But you'll notice too that there may be still a reflection going on. So the easiest way to deal with it that I've found is to simply remove the specular scale. And that will make it so that whenever a player passes underneath it or beside it, then the specular from the light will not show up on their character model. So now that we've got this here, let's toggle it on and off to see the sort of result that we get. So we turn this on and off. But it definitely seems to have lit the area of that map a lot better. And this is essentially what they're doing in a lot of the other maps too, is where they might have a light source coming through the window, but if it's still dark in a particular corner, then they'll just add that additional light to fill it out and make it feel a little bit more natural. Now, I can't say for sure why Void does it this way. My best guess would be to assume it's much faster to iterate the lighting this way. So instead of having to wait upwards of an hour to see the results of a light bake, you can place the light down into the scene and mess with it for a couple of seconds and see the immediate results, which is pretty beneficial, especially if you're under a time constraint. Now, there really isn't a right or wrong way of doing lighting, because in the end, all we really care about is whether or not our map looks cool and epic. In a lot of the cases too, I actually use both methods, and that's ultimately what we're concerned about, whether or not our map looks good or not. But that's pretty much it in terms of the trends I've noticed across all the maps. And now I would actually like to talk to you about the map that we are actually on, which is Valley of the Dolls. Now, the reason why I want to talk about Valley of the Dolls first is because it is very close to the first map I did for Ready or Not, which is Hell Comes to the Hills. So you can see that if you compare the two maps, then the lighting is very, very similar. There may be a slight tonal difference, but we're dealing with basically the same sort of time of day and very similar sort of materials in each map here. And in fact, I basically replicate the exterior material here a little bit for my house as well. So I guess I should preface in terms of what values I am actually looking for when looking at these maps. Unreal Engine 5 works really well when you stick to physically based lighting values, and that's sort of how Lumen is completely designed around. And a lot of the values that you sort of see are probably going to be a lot more larger than you sort of experience. And we sort of want to just make sure that we stick within reasonable boundaries of those values. So to begin with, like, what are like the physical based lighting values then? And ironically enough, if you want to find those values, then you should probably head over to Unity. And they've got a nice little write-up on the difference between, you know, what physical light units are. But they also have, if you scroll down in here, they've got like a nice little cheat sheet that I'm pretty much just going to reference for the rest of the video. And that is these values here. So for like directional light intensities, I'll be looking at here. For like the place lighting, I'll be looking at values around here. And they also fall within the different exposure values here too. So when we're going inside and outside of rooms, and there's also cheat sheets for like color temperature as well. So I guess since we are dealing with a relatively sunsetty sort of scene here, we should be looking for values around 5,000 lux on our directional light. So if we head over to that and we click on it, we see we've got a value of 4,200. I'm sure that was not chosen for any particular reason at all. Maybe a little bit lower than what it could possibly be. 4,200 might be around the scale of maybe a bit too low for what this is at the moment. But I wouldn't say it's anything negative. It just means that the amount of light coming from the directional light will probably not reach the interior as much as it could, which is, you know, what it is. There are other techniques employed in this map to sort of mitigate that. But yeah, so what other values are we actually looking at? So if we look at the light color, seems like there's very minimal change here, almost to the point of not even needing to change anything. And the temperature here, so we've got a temperature of 3,200. And if we go back to our little cheat sheet here, then 3,200 is sort of like maybe about the lower end of what it should be, sunlight noon. We should be maybe seeing values of this instead. But again, lighting is a more artistic expression here too. But when we sort of jump out of the values of physical based lighting, then other things start to also decay as well. So I don't know. It's hard to really assess on whether or not this is good or bad. I guess what other values are changed here? Scattering intensity is increased, I assume, just to increase the amount of scattering in the facade there to sort of really give it the, you know, the old LA smoggy look. The shadow resolution scale is 0.7. I think this is done to maybe blur out the shadow resolution a little bit on backlighting, because the number of dynamic shadow cascades is set to 1. If we increase that to 2, you'll see that the lines become a lot more harsh. So perhaps reducing the shadow resolution scale also blurs out backlighting as well. Nothing else really stands out with this particular light here. I guess, like, since like mentioning the volumetric scattering intensity, we should probably also check out the, I guess, the log of the map. So click on that. The values here don't really have any discussion worthy things to talk about. Reset these to the default values, you see there's very minimal change here. So yeah, nothing really stands out here in terms of the values they decided to choose. Just reset that. I guess going along with other core lighting elements, I see this skylight here. No values are really changed here, so seems pretty standard. See if we can find the sky atmosphere. I don't know if this has changed. Nope, nothing's changed here. So all the values that we see scattering from the lighting are pretty much correct for Earth, because I'm pretty sure that's what it's set at default. And I see right there too that they've also got a sky sphere. So they are sort of using a combination of sky atmosphere and sky sphere. You'll notice too that I'm pretty sure if I type in volumetric here, we don't see any volumetric clouds. I'll come to this in a little second. So the lighting that they actually have, or the sky that they actually have here, is a result of just a HDRI, I think. So if I go to here, I'm pretty sure this uses this HDRI here. I can't open it because they're cooked assets, but they're not using any volumetric clouds or any cloud cards, I don't think. I think this is all just a single HDRI, and it's not animating or anything. And I assume this is mostly for performance reasons as well. Other maps do use cloud cards, but to my knowledge, I do not think any of the clouds in Ready or Not are volumetric. And I assume that this is mainly because of performance concerns, because when you add volumetric clouds to your scene, you do suffer quite a significant hit. So the next thing I should probably look at would be the, I guess, like the light mass importance volume. I think this is it here. So if I scroll out just a little bit, pull it up, it seems to be covering the playable area, which is exactly what we want to see. We do not want to extend the boundaries of the light mass importance volume outside of that, because that increases the volumetric light map density on non-playable areas, and the volumetric light map really only affects like movable objects, so we're not really concerned with how the rest of the map looks there too. I did say that I saw something interesting when I typed in volumetric, and they've got 2 volumetric light map density modifiers here. So the values here is 0, 0, and if we sort of look over the tooltip here, it mentions that it forces the volumetric light map to be the highest density. Now, I don't think this is really needed, because from experience on building thousands and thousands of volumetric light maps, there's enough static mesh density around this map here to not actually have larger cells within the playable space here. So perhaps this was an issue in UE4 and this is sort of just carried over. And I believe this second one here is just the actual mistake and they just forgot to delete it, because I don't think this would actually be doing anything here. And if it is, there would be a very large unnecessary amount of light cells here in a completely non-playable space, and it'd probably be best just to delete it in the end. So I guess the next big major thing I'd want to look at would be definitely the post-processing volume, since a lot of these volumes do, I guess, like the majority of the heavy lifting for the final tone and look of the map. So let's quickly find it. So I know from looking at other void maps that the values in here change pretty drastically from one map to another map. And this is especially true when you compare older maps to newer maps and the DLC maps. I think even though like Valley is probably one of the older maps from 1.0, I do feel like that is probably one of the later maps they worked on towards development or release, because the I guess like one way you can sort of gauge the understanding of lighting is how the lighting artists and the level designers sort of approach using the post-processing, and usually the cleaner or the less values they tweak in it sort of indicate a better understanding. And from looking at the values in here, they've been pretty conservative on it, which is sort of nice to see, because as you start messing with the color grading too much, then it also sort of degrades the quality as it sort of cascades down. So let's sort of look at the values that have actually changed here, and I think I will actually add an additional post-processing volume into the scene, simply so we can compare the two values that are present from the default processing volume compared to what Void actually do. And I guess I will also open up a second details panel just so we can view these. So I'll lock this one and lock the other one too, so we don't lose them as we sort of mess around with these values. Okay, so the editor just crashed then. Sort of a given when working with these cooked assets. They're not the most stable things. They're very temperamental and they do not like you moving things around and undoing changes. So it's just a bit of a heads up for those who want to look around these maps. And also just a heads up, if you see any weird jump cuts, this is sort of the reason why. And moving forward, I'd like to just mention that as a disclaimer, I'm not an expert when it comes to knowing or what each one of these values do. I have enough knowledge to sort of evaluate and hypothesize why specific values may be used, but I wouldn't take everything I say as true and honest facts. And really, I'm just looking around these maps for curiosity's sake and to showcase these values to anyone else who want to, light scenes in Unreal Engine 5. But jumping right back into the post-processing volume, let's sort of look at probably the most arguably important aspects of the whole thing, which are the exposure settings. So immediately, I noticed that the exposure compensation is set to 0, and they are also using an exposure compensation curve. Number one, the exposure compensation set to 0 is common practice for messing with physically based lighting, as we don't want any sort of compensation or modification to our scene, and we sort of want a clean slate moving forward. And that would also be an issue too for the compensation curve when we'd have the two working against each other. So it's sort of good to zero this out. By default, it's set to 1. And although it may not look like it, it is actually doubling the brightness of our scene, as hinted by the tooltip here for the compensation curve. So 1 equals 2 times brighter scene, and that's pretty much exactly what we're seeing here. So I'll just set this back to 0 and go from there. I will come back to the compensation curve in a little bit, but I just want to talk about the min max EV values first. So the values that we do have here is we've got a negative 3.5 and 11 for the min max respectively. None of these really stand out to me. If we're going to look back at our cheat sheet, since we have a low sun, we sort of expect a value of 7 instead of 11 here. But I really don't see any issue with it. If we were to put the value back at 7, the lighting sort of gets blown out and it's overexposed. So let's just move that back to 11 for there. The reason for that could be, like, who knows, there's multiple different compounding elements that could be contributing to it. It could be stuff to do with the values in the directional light. It could be other stuff they've done in the post-processing volume here. But 11 works here, and it's sort of fine, honestly. The negative 3.5, if we go back here, is way below the negative 2 for a moonless, like, pitch black night, I guess. So that doesn't really surprise me either, honestly, because beneath the map is a pretty dark basement. Probably a lot of dark shadows around here too, so having that value around here is honestly fine, and I don't see an issue with it either. So going back to the exposure curve, unfortunately we cannot open this up in the editor since it's a cooked asset, but fortunately we can recreate it using Fmodel. So what is the curve actually doing? So on any EV value of 2, it's having a value of -2. And that sort of goes all the way up to 9, where at least up to here, we're still reducing the brightness of the scene by a factor of 0.5. And between 9 and 10, we are actually doubling the brightness here. So what does this actually mean in the scene? So again, if we sort of go back to the tooltip on the post-processing thing, it says that values of -2 make the scene 4 times darker, and a value of 1 makes the scene 2 times brighter. So this basically means that in pretty much all the dark areas here, this is mainly meant to make it even darker. So without it, this scene is actually a bit overblown and a bit too bright, and it really doesn't look like a creepy basement. So it's really just controlling that to make it a lot darker. The unfortunate side effect of this is that it also makes the rest of the interior a lot darker than it probably needs to be as well. So if I turn that off, the interior seems a little bit more naturally, probably a bit too bright actually. So maybe it's not as bad in the section here, but definitely in the, I guess, like the rooms with a lot of windows, it seems a little bit too dark in my opinion. But either way, the map still looks pretty fine. Again, I'm not trying to like criticize or judge anything here. It's just some general observations that I'm making. The giant spike in the curve there from 9 to 10 is mainly so if we go to the exterior and look towards the sun, then it makes the scene look a lot more brighter. And that really only doesn't kick in until we start looking at this here. And I can actually demonstrate that if I visualize the eye adaptation here too. So pretty much majority of the scene, that's not kicking in. But as soon as we start moving towards the sun, it definitely gets blown up more than it needs to. So we can see that here too. So yeah, for the majority of the map though, that section isn't being kicked in, and more or less it's actually being darkened. Well, most of the interior is being darkened by that. So yeah, that's pretty much the exposure settings here. What other values do we actually see? So let's just turn on the modified properties only. They do shift the tone and temperature of the map a little bit here to make it look a little bit more warm. Yeah, very, very slight modification here. So I don't know, maybe you can see it a little bit better inside. Maybe I can turn off the visualization here. We don't really need this anymore. So turn that on. Yeah, you definitely see it makes the interior a little bit warmer. Very subtly though. But I feel that it's a decent change to make. The gain here is actually interesting because what this is doing is, I believe it's making the shadows a little bit more blue. If I turn this on and off, yeah, it's definitely making those darker areas for the shadows. This is actually a pretty cool change. It definitely makes the shadows deeper and richer, so it works out really well. I have noticed too, they've got a lookup table added here, but they actually haven't used it. Just turn this on because I'm curious what it's actually going to do. All right, so it sort of like puts I guess like a vintage tone on the whole map here. And I feel like that is maybe a little bit too overblown. What else do we have here? Yeah, there's really not that much else to talk about, but the post-processing is pretty decent. Oh, actually, I didn't talk about the toe and the slope. So aside from the exposure being probably the most critical aspects of the post-processing volume, I would say the next most important stuff would be the toe and the slope. They are probably the first things you should modify if you need to just minutely adjust the brightness or darkness of your map. So if your map is too dark, you can bring down the toe, and that will brighten the scene up a little bit, or sort of bring in those highlights and reduce the shadows a little bit. And you can also do the opposite as well. It does the inverse effect. And the slope sort of also has a similar sort of effect as the toe. I think to my understanding, it's more to do with the mid-tone contrast. So bringing that down sort of removes the contrast, and then bringing it up also adds a little bit more contrast too. So that's sort of what's going on there. So in this case here, they sort of made the scene a little bit more contrasty. If I actually turn that off and turn this back on, it doesn't actually seem like it's actually doing much. So I don't know how necessary these changes are needed. To me, that seems virtually doesn't really seem to do anything. Maybe it has more an impact downstairs. So no, not really. Honestly, these changes maybe a little bit unnecessary. But to sort of like summarize the whole thing, pretty decent post-processing volume, very conservative, and that's sort of my preference. Very little changes, mostly focused in the exposure aspects here, and the very slight changes to the tone of the map with the temperature, and the bringing in the blues to the shadows with the shadow gain, which is a very nice addition. Honestly, it looks really good. So very nice job on the post-processing on this one here. Let's talk about I guess the reflections. So let's just clean this up a bit. So reflections, nothing really stands out here to me. They use a combination of box and spherical captures. It's pretty standard, honestly. Most of the box captures are for interior spaces only. They use large spherical ones for capturing the entirety of the exterior, which is pretty common as well. You'll even see some on the facade as well, where they are, if I can find one, there's one there, where they try and capture reflections on the buildings here. Usually it's a really good idea to have one giant spherical capture to capture the majority of the map too, so everything's got a reflection. You got one there. You got one over here too. If I can select that, yep. So pretty standard. Nothing really out of the ordinary to comment on. I guess like the only thing maybe, I did notice this here. There's a bit of a issue going on with the box reflections here. So this is a pretty common example, a pretty common issue, that if you don't set up their transition lines properly, then they can cause this weird jarring look on the weird jarring grid-like issue where the patterns don't transition properly. I think if we look above here, what's causing it would probably be this one here. So if we look at this, and you can see like the transition from the floor above is actually causing that. So if I move that up, that sort of like works out a little bit better. But then you've got this transition over here that's going on, which means another weird adjustment that might need to go on here. So I keep on moving up and down. You sort of see where this is going. Maybe this needs to move up a little bit more or down. Who knows? It's just a balancing act that you have to do with box reflections. But nothing really out of the ordinary in terms of reflections here. It's pretty decent. Before continuing, I'd like to quickly look at the Lightmap resolutions around the scene. What I'm looking for specifically is a consistent grid pattern across the walls, especially where they meet each other and where they meet the ceilings and the floors. I'm looking for green for most of the interior and blue for most of the exterior, and that seems to be the case here. You don't need a lot of resolution for the non-playable space where the player won't be interacting with it, but the interior does need to usually have a higher resolution to capture correct shadows, and that seems to be the case for the majority of the interior here as well. A couple of props are blue. You don't always need to push it to green, but pushing everything higher just increases the build time and the file size. So if you can get away with a lower resolution, then you should probably try and do that. I noticed a couple of anomalies. The trees here are absurdly high, and this is an issue that was introduced with the most recent update where they implemented a new LED system, and I think they just simply forgot to go back and double check the Lightmap resolutions on a bunch of foliage. Overall, I think they've done a really decent job across the map. Just a couple of anomalies here and there. And finally, I think we should take a look at all the different lights around the scene. So going past the directional and start looking at the point, the rect, and the spotlights of the scene. So with the point lights, there's not many. There's only, what is that, 21? And one thing I am looking for with all the point lights is, well, number one, that make sure none of them are stationary or movable, because we definitely do not want dynamic shadows being cast with any of these lights here. And I do not see their mobility set to movable in any of these, which is awesome. What about some of the values? So I guess like going back to the cheat sheet for local light intensities is what we're mostly looking for. So interior lights, we're mostly looking at around 1,000, between that like 300 to 1,000 range. So we sort of go to some of them. What is this one here? Okay, a little red light. It's about 800. Can't see anything wrong with that. This is a large light here, I think. How big is that radius? That's pretty big, actually. That one there is an intensity of 4,200. Again, I wonder why they chose that number. Don't really see anything different about it that's worth noting. It seems like most of these are 1,000, 1,000 seems fine. 1,000, 100 for these low red lights. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Some of that light there maybe would be better there. I don't know, who knows. But yeah, 10. Do we see a 10 just then? That one's a bit strange though. This is a strange light. Maybe they just need that little, okay, I see what they're doing there. There's a small warm glow in the middle there to make it look a little bit different. It's a nice little detail. Really, yeah, I don't see anything strange about these. Or sticking in the, oh, what's this one? This is a, okay, so they're just like using this as a fake lighting for underneath the stairs, which is fine as well. Like, this is what we discussed about earlier, using a really low intensity. They haven't disabled that though. Specular scale is 0, which is what we mentioned before, and increase the source radius and soft radius as well. So a very small fake light under the stairs to sort of illuminate that, which is absolutely fine. So let's move on to spotlights then. So a lot more spotlights than there were point lights. We have a couple stationaries. I assume these are mostly here to cast dynamic shadows. So let's quickly see if they are. All right, so this is a technique which I'll come back to in a little bit, which is really cool. But they're using a separate lighting channel for a lot of these things here, and that's mostly for performance or dynamic shadows. I'll come back to it in a little bit here, but we've got a couple of stationaries, and all the stationaries that cast dynamic lighting, they all should be on channel 1. This is a movable on 0. It is casting a dynamic shadow, which is fine. What else is there? Yeah, any other stationary lights, they are set on that additional lighting channel. What about values? I don't think there's anything too crazy with these values here. Go through them real fast. They all seem like pretty standard values for interior lighting. Nothing out of the ordinary there. I'll come back and address these stationary lights in a little bit, but first we'll just quickly look at the Rect Lights as well. So the majority of the Rect Lights, how many do they have? They got 51. The majority of the Rect Lights, I have noticed, are mainly used to fake global illumination at the windows. A lot of these Rect Lights are pretty much just along the windows. You can kind of see how many they've got set up around here, which is a technique I also use on Hell Comes to the Hills to get that extra global illumination into the building. There's nothing, I don't think there's anything really worth mentioning with most of these here. Like, I think most of these are pretty much about the same sort of intensity too. Like, there's 100 there, so let's look at that compared to what the other ones are. Oh, this is an interesting one. So I saw this Rect Light earlier. It's a small one to fake the global illumination and bounces off the white wall into the tent. I thought that was a pretty cool trick there. There's another one here to, I guess, I do an additional amount of light into the bathroom. TV. There's a couple for the strip lights. This is another fake lighting one too, where they are projecting a little bit more light into the kitchen. I do not know if there's anything really major to talk about with this one here. They're just trying to get a little bit more light into the scene here. One thing I did notice about this one is they didn't completely remove the specular from this one here, so there might be some reflections on the character, but after thinking that and then loading the game up, I actually didn't see anything like that. A small Rect Light there. Actually, there's a couple here. I'm not sure the intent here. I know they're trying to do like LED strips here, but without a source, it's a little bit strange. Oh, that's a really bright purple one. So where is this? Okay, so these are some Rect Lights in the greenhouse. I guess it's just really high values here to make sure they overcome the directional light. They're using a couple of Rect Lights for the recessed lighting in the ceiling. And yeah, most of these Rect Lights are mostly just for the windows with faking some lighting going into the main building. There is one other one I like to point out here in that there's a Rect Light here in front of another Rect Light. They're both facing this direction. It may not look like it, but they are both facing the couches here. I assume this Rect Light is being put here to try and prevent the shadows from the crates being projected from this other Rect Light. I'm not really sure about this one though. It's that would be my best guess on what they're doing here. This one's a movable light too. I believe this has got a flicker. No, it doesn't have a field flicker, but it does have an IES. And I guess, like, speaking of IES, there is a couple to change the look of a couple of the lights. I noticed for these ones here, they've got some profiles on here. So there's a really bright at the midpoint, but it drops off quite dramatically past that midpoint there. And there are a couple used in the basement. I think we saw one earlier. I can find it, that is. I think this is one. You got one here that allows you to get that like ringing effect on the ground there, which gives you a nice little free detail on that light itself. So yeah, there's lights are pretty standard, honestly. Nothing stands out too crazy. So I did mention the recessed lighting a little bit too. A lot of these buildings here, they don't have actual light sources, but they are using emissive as for static lighting. So for the values of these emissive materials, let me see if I can quickly find them. So I won't be able to open this up, but we do have a tool that allows us to create a duplicate. So I'm going to create a material instance here, and I will find our tools. So the tool that we're actually looking for is the one that's located under mods, tools, material instance editor, and just right click on it and click on run. And I'll quickly go back to that material that I created in an instance back there. I'm going to chuck this in here. So really, we don't have the ability to edit the cooked material instances. So we need to use this tool to do so. And the only reason I'm doing this at the moment is to show you the intensity of what this light actually is. So we've got the color value here, which is like this orangey color here. And I want to point out the intensity values for the lighting because they're still using these local light intensities here. So they're using pretty much close to the interior lighting. So 850, pretty decent. I can like bump that up to 2000 maybe. And if I plop that in here, you can see the amount of intensity it goes. So all the lighting that you see in like the circles and the recessed lighting here, apart from maybe the rect here, but I think they still is using the lights there. They are using those emissive materials with actual physical based lighting values from earlier. Now, I said I'd come back and discuss this, and I honestly cannot wait to share this with you because this is by far the coolest thing that I've discovered from looking at void maps. And that is that wherever they use dynamic shadows for their lighting, they have set the lighting channel to be on channel 1 instead of on channel 0. And this is honestly so simple that it's genius. And I cannot believe I've never heard of this before or anyone discussed this when optimizing lighting in Unreal Engine 5. Now, why is this so important? Well, I've got a little example to show you here. Usually the first piece of advice that someone gives a person looking to optimize the lighting in their level is to disable any dynamic shadows. And this is simply because dynamic shadows have a rather significant performance cost attached to them. Now, as a very low level and very, very basic explanation on why this is, that any light that needs to cast dynamic shadows, any object that it casts onto will basically need to render that object's primitives twice to display them. So I have an extreme example here of one of the maps we are working on. And one of the gimmicks of this map is that we have random lightning strikes that cast dynamic shadows. And I want to really demonstrate this extreme example here because these lights cast over the entire map. So I want you to pay attention to the number of primitives that are currently being rendered in the scene here. We're sort of sitting around 3,000-ish primitives, but watch what happens when I increase the intensity and basically turn that light on. You'll see that it's basically doubled in the amount of primitives that are now being drawn on the scene. But watch what happens when I switch the lighting channel to only cast lights on channel 1. You'll notice that the primitives have now only gone back down to 3,000, and it does not matter if I turn the light on and off, whether or not the amount of primitives really increases or decreases. So controlling which meshes cast dynamic shadows is a pretty big thing when it comes down to performance. No longer do we need to worry about bleeding through floors or walls. We can just select which meshes need to cast those shadows and isolate it for that particular section of the map. So back here in Ready or Not, we just want to look over a couple of different examples. I've confirmed in the game that the only things that cast dynamic shadows or receive them are the player character and AI, as well as any meshes that have that channel enabled in their properties. So to look at this first example, let's just have a look at the circumference or the radius of this spotlight here to see what things would be casting dynamic shadows. So I would assume that the floor would be accepting that channel, and I am correct. The walls also have that channel enabled. What about these wall panels? These wall panels do not have any dynamic shadows enabled, and that makes sense too, because you really wouldn't get much benefit coming from like the direction that light is casting from. I don't think any of these have. Nope. What about the door frame? The door frame doesn't cast shadows, which is fine too. It's sort of in between the walls, so it makes sense that it wouldn't really be casting much of a influential shadow. The floor in the opposing room does not accept it, but even if that was enabled, maybe there could have been light in that room as well. So looking in the circumference here, what about the doormat? The doormat does accept it, so there we go. What about here? I just want to toggle that too, so you see the influence that light has. And what about these little garden lights? No, they do not cast dynamic shadows either. I guess the final thing I want to check out too, which would make sense, it wouldn't cast a dynamic shadow, would be this little window frame. And yep, they do not cast dynamic shadows. So yeah, they really only cast the shadows on the meshes that need to receive the lighting. So let's check out another one. Let's just find a random one here just to sort of see what else is going on. All right, so this is the creepy room in the basement. So let's just check out what is actually being cast here as well. So I would assume that anything that is in the direct radius in this room here would be on channel 1, and anything that might be bleeding out of it is probably not accepting, but we'll just check the room here first to see what is accepting that channel. It makes sense that the table is accepting that. What about these little objects on there too? Yep. Same with the walls, the decals, I guess. What about the objects behind the light? Does that actually do anything? Is that a mesh component? It is accepting light there. Is there another dynamic? Oh, there is another stationary light there casting dynamic shadows. So let me just confirm that. Yep. All right, cool. So I guess it sort of makes sense that all these things here, but I'm interested to see objects outside of that sort of radius and see if they are also casting a shadow as well. So I guess the stairs would be the first thing to look at. So this seems to be part of the entire architecture. So I would assume that, oh, it's actually not casting dynamic shadows there. So how big is this object in terms of tries? So this has, oh, there's 7,000 tries. So that's a pretty significant saving if it doesn't need to cast dynamic lights then. So that's pretty cool. What about other objects that might be in the radius here? I assume maybe these light blockers here are not, yep, they're not casting any shadows, doesn't need to. So going back down here, I think there's some, maybe it's hitting the couch here. So is there any other objects really past this light? It's pretty decent there as well for controlling everything outside just this room. And for prosperity's sake, let's check out one more light, and let's choose another one at random. So this one definitely bleeds through a lot of different walls, so this is an excellent example to look at. So my first assumptions would be to assume that everything in this room would have the channel 1 enabled. So let's just double check those. Yep. Yep, yep. Yep, yep. Yep. What about back here? Maybe this doesn't need to cast dynamic shadow, but it is receiving it. If I just turn that off, what was the effect? Basically nothing. All right, cool. So maybe that could be actually disabled as just a super minor optimization there. What else? Okay, so we do want to check out the objects outside of this room here and stuff that might be clipping through this thing. That might be clipping through the wall, and I would definitely want to check this phase here. This phase does not have it enabled, which makes sense because there's no movable lights there. And this is actually a really good spot because there's also another movable light there too. So we have two intersections going on there. So you can see that if this object also had that channel enabled, it might actually be drawing 3 times. So that's a pretty good saving there. And I guess like we should check the room in here, because I don't think there's there's no dynamic shadows being cast in here. So I can't check this washing machine because it's an instance for some reason. I don't know what's going on there. This milk carton does not have it. What about these shelves? Nope. What about the door frame? Nope, the door frame doesn't. Very interesting. What about just outside here? I don't see any meshes actually. Let's check this painting. Yep. And what about in here? And even these crates do not have any dynamic shadows either. What about the speakers? Oh. So you can see like they've done a pretty decent job on just isolating the lights and any object that these lights cast onto. Like I said before, this is an awesome technique. I've never seen it utilized or mentioned anywhere before, and I can't wait to start adding this to my own maps. I hope anyone watching this too also finds it as interesting and cool as I do, because it is a very cool technique to reduce the amount of primitive draws from dynamic lights. So even though I did say I wasn't going to do a critique of the map, there are some sections I would like to point out that I think could use some improvement. And I feel like I would be neglecting my duty, I guess, not to point this out to any other level designers or lighting artists out there. So one thing I have noticed that nearly every single Void map does is that each of the rooms is generally one giant continuous mesh. So they've conjoined all the walls, all the ceilings, and all the floors into one giant mesh. And this basically means that the bounds of the object is much larger than what it needs to be. And this is important because it deals with the dynamic culling and pre-computed visibility that goes on in the background. So what is rendered and what's not rendered when the player isn't looking at it. The bounds of these objects are much larger than they need to be, when in reality, a lot of the walls probably don't need to be rendered, especially if you are maybe below or above them. Then you can have situations where the rooms above or below can be rendered at the same time. And if we actually look at the number of tries on this room here, there are 4,408 for a room. And how big is this room actually as well? So there's a lot of zigzags here, which can be a bit of a concern. So even if you are maybe down here, the way Unreal Engine works is if it hits the bounds of one of these objects here, it will most likely render that whole room up here, which is not ideal. So although it is a little bit more micromanagey, I do recommend that you separate every single wall from each other, as well as the ceiling and the floor. The only time I don't do that is when we have these 90-degree convex corners, where you may want to put some normal weighting on the corners to make them look a little bit softer around, which is what they've actually done here as well. And besides the issues with culling that can occur with having continuous rooms like this, you also have issues with the light solver not knowing where light is entering and exiting the room, especially with these very complex zigzaggy sort of forms where they're not an enclosed convex map. They're basically concave, and they've got a lot of like one-sided geometry going on. So you do get a lot of the weird light bleeding that's happening at the top here, the weird lighting that's coming from here for some reason. And this is another really good example of the light entering the room, because the mesh is just maybe a little bit too complex for the light solver to actually figure out what should be painted and what shouldn't be. This actually could be solved with a light blocker at the top of the roof here, but either way, I believe a lot of the weird lighting issues that are going on in this room in particular could be solved if the walls and the ceilings and floors were separated into individual meshes. Now, it does add a little bit more micromanagement to the complexity of the layout, but if you are aiming and striving for the best lighting possible, then it's just something that you have to take on the chin and do anyway. But I think this is really all I have to say about Valley. So I know this has been a pretty long video, so thanks for sticking around so long. I do hope that you found some stuff interesting and informative, especially on how Void lights their maps. I do plan to do other videos in the future, so if you're interested in looking at some of the other maps from the game, chuck a subscribe and I'll try and get those out as soon as I can. So in conclusion then, what are my final thoughts on Valley? Well, there was a reason I chose it first, and that's because I think the lighting in Valley is probably my favorite in any of the Void maps, and it was definitely an inspiration for Hell Comes to the Hills, and definitely an inspiration to me in terms of replicating physically based lighting in Unreal Engine 5. I think the values they used for the lights and the directional lights are pretty on board in terms of physical based lighting. Within reason, I think there's a couple of things that could maybe be a little bit better here and there. The Rect Lights that they use for global illumination around the windows was a very cool technique that I noticed back in early access when we had very, very crude rips of the map, but we didn't have values for the lighting. So I saw that really early on, and I definitely implemented that in Hell Comes to the Hills. The post-processing volume for this map is awesome. I love it. It's very conservative. Very sensible values are used, and they put all the right features in it to just get that last little extra amount of detail out of the map. So whoever did the lighting and post-processing for this map, I think they did an awesome job. And it's definitely been an inspiration for me in terms of my pursuit of better lighting and understanding lighting within Unreal Engine. It was also really awesome to see that dynamic shadow hack with the lighting channels. I've never seen that before, and seeing that implemented in this map here is just almost mind-blowing to me. I know it seems a little bit over-exaggerating, but it was a very cool technique I've seen, and I'm definitely using that technique in my previous maps and any stuff moving forward. But yeah, awesomely lit map. I think they did an awesome job, and I'm keen to break down some other maps in the future. So that's about it from me, I guess. Until the next videos, I'll catch you later.